But there are changes, and they are happening now, and I think that they are going to increase in speed. Now, in the West and the United States in particular, right now there's about to be the summit for democracy. Right, I'm sure you're seeing a lot of press about that. There was an alternative summit in Moscow last week, which is perhaps rather more significant, and the Western media didn't pick it up. What that was, a meeting with finance ministers and various other related professionals from all the countries that belong to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, security group throughout Eurasia, including China, India, and Russia. Pakistan is in that. Saudi Arabia has just joined it. Between those guys, the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a free trade bloc, including Russia and four of the other Eurasian countries, including Kazakhstan, a fairly major free trade area. The Commonwealth of Independent States, which pretty much includes all the ex-Soviet nations in that bloc, as well as the BRICS. Now, when you put all that together, I wish I had a map to show you, but you put all those members of all of those countries involved in all of those institutions together, it becomes dominant. The talk, the discussions that were held were how to integrate all of those different blocks, the SCO, the CIS, the EAEU, and the BRICS Plus into one commonality. And discussions are taking place as to how to achieve that, and when it should be done, how it should be done, all the other institutions that need to be arranged to sort that out. Now, if that were to happen, let's call it a mega BRICS Plus, then that would dwarf the G7. That is a really big deal. That's a huge block. And if that gets pulled off, then that is going to really usher in the multipolar world that we've been discussing. It will dwarf the current composite of what makes up the Western nations. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is not for me to say, but it is on the way to perhaps being realized. And I think that the West has not really caught on that these changes are happening, and they're happening now.
Welcome to RTD Interviews. Today, I'm excited to have returning guest, Mr. Christ Devonshire-Ellis, the founder of Devonshire and Associates, and is the managing director of Asia Briefing Publications. Chris has over 30 years of experience advising multinational corporations and foreign governments on their investment strategies for the China-Asian region, and most recently dealing with the Belt and Road countries. And today, he's joined us to share his thoughts on the economy, geopolitical tensions, as well as the latest events with the BRICS nations. And so, once again, Chris, welcome to RTD Interviews.
Okay, great. Thank you to be here.
Thank you for taking time to join me here on RTD Interviews. And so, as I mentioned before we went live, we last connected in 2019, and that was more so the introduction to the Western world on all the developments with the BRICS nations and the AIIB, the New Development Bank, and all those institutions that were newly being formed. So here we are now, 2023, in the thick of things, and the news is just bombarded with talks on what's happening out in your region. So you're currently in Moscow. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on what's going on and how things are playing out on your side, because the narrative we're getting here, I'm sure, is quite different. But before I dive into all that, for those who may not be familiar with you, can you give us a brief introduction beyond what I mentioned about your background and what you're currently doing up now?
Right. Well, my firm, Devonshire and Associates, with 30 years, as you said, we advise foreign companies, international businesses, many from the US, into the Asian markets, primarily China, India, and the ASEAN nations. We're also in the Middle East. My focus, however, has changed to concentrating on Eurasia, the Belt and Road Initiative, and what's happening with emerging blocs such as the BRICS and other regional institutions, which are now gaining traction. A lot has happened since we last spoke, of course. That was in 2019. At the beginning of last year, the Ukraine conflict began, and now we're a year on from that, and there's been huge geopolitical changes. So I think that's what we'll perhaps be discussing today, and hopefully my insights from this part of the world can perhaps be of use to some of your viewers on your side of the world. So let's fire away.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So, very first question I'd like to put out there just to get an idea as to what you're keeping an eye on. Of course, you mentioned all the things that you're currently focusing on. So, what are some things that concerns you, or more likely excites you about all this recent change that's underway?
Well, of course, the current conflict is a great concern, and there's a potential for other conflicts springing up elsewhere in the world, not just Taiwan, although I don't want to talk about that too much, but also in the Balkans. There's been problems in Serbia. There has been issues between Iran and Azerbaijan, and talks of war in the Western Middle East. So there are a lot of regional tensions, and I think we're going through a period of some geopolitical stresses and the emergence of what will be, I think, some realignment of the world order. That creates stresses in its own right. So yes, a lot of changes, and there are concerns within that. In the Western world, of course, has its own very partisan view on what's been going on, particularly as concerns Ukraine. I have to say that view is not necessarily shared in Asia. There is some pushback against the behavior of the United States in terms of massive volumes of sanctions which it has put upon Russia. That is creating issues elsewhere, particularly in Asia. Prices going up, meaning that some of the Asian economies have not been able to buy energy. Pakistan, for example, had no energy for 6 months, so I don't think they're particularly happy with the situation. There have been food shortages in Africa and other emerging Asian economies as well. So the development of this conflict and the United States and West's part in that is not necessarily received particularly favorably in Asia and other areas of the world. I'm not entirely sure how much the West actually understands this. I think they seem to think that the world is perhaps all centered on them, but of course there's 9 billion people on the planet, and each and every one of those is affected. And the outcome of that, their opinion on what's happening, is not always positive. So there are need for changes. I think one of the major pushbacks has been the decision by the US and the EU to impose not just sanctions, although that has had secondary fallout upon other countries, as I just mentioned, but also using the SWIFT global banking network as a political tool to prevent trade. Now, although there are pros and cons in doing that, and people have opinions on whether or not Russia should have been cut off from the global financial institutions, the fact remains that in doing so, the US or the West have actually undermined the global credibility of the SWIFT network, because in cutting Russia off and imposing all those sanctions, other countries are kind of now looking around and thinking, well, this could happen to us. And this is driving forward new changes in global financing, the use of the dollar, the euro, other currencies. It's also driving through new technologies as alternatives to SWIFT. So we're living in an era of some change. We haven't come out the other end yet, so that makes it even more interesting. I don't know if I'd use the word exciting, but certainly we are living in interesting times. And I should point out that may you live in interesting times is not a harbinger of good things in terms of Chinese proverbs. A Chinese curse is may you live in interesting times. The world is now living through interesting times, and we need to get to the other side, to a more peaceful and safe harbor.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in finding out, how that process will play out, just because as always, whenever change occurs, it's usually nasty in the beginning, and it evens out during the middle, and it has more clarity at the end. And we're just at the very beginning. Now, I want to get your thoughts on, the word that's been used a lot, multipolar world and new monetary order and things of that nature. That's pretty much been given to us on the West about what's taking place out in your region, given the fact you're in Moscow now. What exactly is this multipolar world, and how is it shaping out, and how does Russia and China play a major part in that?
Well, Russia and China have been vocal critics for a number of years now concerning what they perceive as being a unipolar world, led effectively by the United States. The US and its allies tends to regard that as the basis of a rules-based international order and something that is not up for negotiation. That opinion is not shared else in many other countries. It's perceived as the West wanting to hold on to its position of power and to be able to dictate global policies and put those onto other countries. And I think there is some evidence, some significant evidence, that the United States and the West has perhaps overstepped the mark in wanting to transpose what its views are upon other countries' economies, leading to a lack of sovereignty. This is especially true in the financial markets and trade markets. Tariffs against China, sanctions without going through international bodies such as the World Trade Organization, the giving of loans which are impacted, whether you get them or not, means you have to follow US policy by the World Bank and IMF. There's pushback against this. So I think that in Asia and the other part of the world, again, there is some unhappiness. So they're looking for a more multipolar approach, whereby it's not unilaterally or perceived as being unilateral with the United States solely in charge, but it's perceived as being a conglomerate of different countries equally and fairly sharing their views on how the world should be managed. And this affects everything, not just from finance, but also how we deal with issues such as climate change. And one may add, one may have the opinion that so far a unipolar world has not particularly dealt very well with global finances. We still have mass poverty. Countries are in debt. There's starvation. We are not hitting global targets as regards carbon dioxide emissions and so on and so forth. So there's a groundswell of opinion outside of the West that there is a need for change, and that decisions that impact the world need to be shared on a much more inclusive rather than exclusive basis. And this is really where the crux of the dilemma is today. We're sort of in a West versus East plus everyone else mode, and this is creating stresses and tensions.
Now, you mentioned change, and what a coincidence that last week, Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, President Putin and Xi met in Moscow, and on the departure, it was quite obvious that they strategically had cameras around, and it looks like through the translation that President Xi said that we're on the cusp of change that hasn't been seen to the likes of 100 years or something like that, referring to change in 100 years. In your opinion, what exactly, what type of change is he referring to, based upon what you're seeing from your side of the world?
That comment got a lot of attention, a lot of it negative, particularly in the West, where it was viewed as dangerous or something unknown that was going to happen. Perhaps that China and Russia would take over the world. I don't think that's going to happen. But there are changes, and they are happening now, and I think that they are going to increase in speed. Now, in the West and the United States in particular, right now there's about to be the summit for democracy. Right, I'm sure you're seeing a lot of press about that. There was an alternative summit in Moscow last week, which is perhaps rather more significant, and the Western media didn't pick it up. What that was, it was a meeting with finance ministers and various other related professionals from all the countries that belong to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, security group throughout Eurasia, including China, India, and Russia. Pakistan is in that. Saudi Arabia has just joined it. Between those guys, the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a free trade bloc, including Russia and 4 of the other Eurasian countries, including Kazakhstan, a fairly major free trade area. The Commonwealth of Independent States, which pretty much includes all the ex-Soviet nations in that bloc, as well as the BRICS. Now, when you put all that together, I wish I had a map to show you, but you put all those members of all of those countries involved in all of those institutions together, it becomes dominant. The discussions that were held were how to integrate all of those different blocks, the SCO, the CIS, the EAEU, and the BRICS Plus, into one commonality. Discussions are taking place as to how to achieve that, and when it should be done, how it should be done, all the other institutions that need to be arranged to sort that out. Now, if that were to happen, let's call it a mega BRICS Plus, then that would dwarf the G7. I should also point out that the BRICS alone, just this year, or in the last 12 months, just the BRICS alone, the current 5 members of that, their GDP overtook that of the G7 in 2022. So when you include the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, and these other things all together, that is a really big deal. That's a huge block. And if that gets pulled off, then that is going to really usher in the multipolar world that we've been discussing. It will dwarf the current composite of what makes up the Western nations. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is not for me to say, but it is on the way to perhaps being realized. And I think that the West has not really caught on that these changes are happening, and they're happening now.
Now, wow. Okay, so that's interesting perspective there, and I didn't hear about that until you just mentioned. So thank you. So if you take all those unions, the BRICS, the SCO, the Eurasian, and the independent states, which makes up that entire region there, if you bring them all together, what type of financial, what type of structure, what type of system will they use, to, I guess, establish trust amongst those countries when it comes to the monetary system?
Well, that's a key issue, isn't it? Particularly as this combined bloc, the mega BRICS Plus, would have a security aspect amongst them. A lot of that already exists within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but how you encourage trade between them and finance that trade is the other key issues, which will really affect everyone else's daily life as we buy and consume goods and products from all over. So the two aspects to that, first of all, in terms of trade, now the Eurasian Economic Union is a free trade bloc. So I think you could see that perhaps there would be an expansion of that the Eurasian Economic Union would start to have agreements with other countries. I believe there's about 20 other countries which have applied to have free trade agreements with the Eurasian Economic Union, and that is a work in progress. Now, these include countries such as India, huge in its own right, massive consumer market, massive producer. Indonesia, the largest Islamic population in the world, it's got a population of 390 million people, I believe, huge country. And other significant players in ASEAN and elsewhere, the United Arab Emirates, and countries in South America, such as Argentina, Brazil, are also interested in having free trade agreements with the Eurasian Economic Union. So I see that continuing. So that deals with the legalities of trade, reducing tariffs and encouraging trade between them. In terms of a finance issue, that is perhaps where a lot of your viewers will be interested. That is a work in progress. I already mentioned that countries are specifically unhappy with what has transpired as regards using SWIFT for political tools. It was never intended to do that. It was supposed to be a global financial system, which the US would oversee to combat money laundering, drug smuggling, these sorts of things. It's now morphed into being used as a political tool. And there are problems with that, as countries are afraid that that sort of thing that happened to Russia could happen to them. The Indonesian president last week reiterated this exactly to his own banks in Indonesia, significant country. So I think that what is starting to happen is that initially there's going to be different phases. Phase one, which is underway now, is that countries are starting to not use the US dollar and the euro, and instead trade in their local currencies. So, for example, Indonesia and China would trade in the rupiah or the renminbi yuan together, rather than put those transactions into the US dollar, have the exchange rate fluctuations, have to pay fees to US banks as intermediate banks, and so on and so forth. So what's happening has been that the US dollar and euro use, and potentially the Japanese yen and British pound, their role in international transactions is going to decrease, while that of other currencies, and especially the renminbi yuan, is going to increase. Now, the ASEAN meetings, the 10 nations of Southeast Asia, their finance meetings and the heads of their central banks are meeting right now in Bali, in Indonesia. The key topic on discussion there is de-dollarization of that entire community. And instead of all those 10 ASEAN countries trading in US dollars and euros together, there's talk of them ditching that and trading in their respective currencies. So you'd have Singapore dollar would trade with Thai baht, with the Malaysian ringgit, and so on and so forth, all the other currencies that are involved. So this, I think, is gaining a great deal of traction. It's significant that just at the beginning of this week, the first Chinese yuan denominated trade in LNG was performed, with China paying the United Arab Emirates for, I think, 65 million tons of gas. The UAE is a gas hub, as you know. They paid for that in yuan. So the United Arab Emirates has received that payment in Chinese renminbi. It's the first time this has happened. So we're going to start to see issues such as the rise of instead of a petrodollar, the petro yuan is going to happen. This is gathering steam, and I think will become much more visible, certainly by the end of this year and into next. It's going to be, the trend is to move away from US dollar and euro in trade. Should the United States be worried about this? Well, I'm not a US economist, so it's not really for me to say, but I should point out, maybe to allay some fears, that just 25% of the United States GDP is in international trade. 75% of it, of America's GDP, is domestic trade. So how this impacts upon the use of the US dollar, I think impact is going to be there, but I don't think it's going to still destabilize the currency or anything. So I think people need not worry. But for people dealing in the international arena, such as myself, based in Asia, then it is going to be a big deal. And we're going to be seeing many more settlements, particularly in renminbi yuan, but also in other currencies, the Indian rupee, and so on and so forth. So that is a major change. That's happening now. The second part of that is, where do we go on from that in terms of digitization? So there's people always get excited when talking about cryptocurrencies. Unfortunately, that excitement is going to lessen, because cryptocurrencies are going to end up being regulated by national banks. So it's just going to be a digital version of a dollar or the euro or the Chinese renminbi yuan you have in your pocket. It's just going to be a digital version of that. So nothing much is going to happen in terms of cryptocurrencies, except the fact that it's going to be heavily regulated. However, so that's the issue there. However, there are additional moves which are being trialed now in terms of linking digital currencies, tokens, to assets rather than debt. So what this would mean, and Iran is actually trialing this with Russia right now, both heavily sanctioned countries, both cut off from SWIFT. So they're looking at alternatives. And the plan there is that they will create a digital currency based upon the value of gold in this case. So it'll be linked to the gold standard, if you were, and they will use that to conduct trade. So this is something for the future. Why don't they want to conduct trade in rubles and in the Iranian rial? Well, the reason is that nobody wants the Iranian currency, and Russia's trade with Iran with the dollar is far superior. So Russia doesn't want to acquire Iranian banknotes, but it's happy to acquire Iranian gold. So these sorts of movements to the creation, I think we're going to start to see this from next year and certainly 2025 onwards, whereby countries will start to use digital tokens as a form of cryptocurrency supported by the central banks and a real asset in the ground. Now, the interesting thing is that doesn't have to be just backed by gold. It could be backed by tokens, could be backed by oil or gas or other commodities that have real value. Timber, maybe, is a commodity that's growing in value. Agricultural products, grains, for example, even fresh water. These are increasingly valuable commodities. And I think that one of the trends for the second half of this particular decade is going to be the emergence of digital tokens, which have value and set against a real asset that is available. So I think that this is going to change the nature of international trade, how we pay for things, and how we do that in the new digital world. That is going to be a big issue. But I think that the way ahead is already planned out. It needs trialing. It needs other people to come on board. But that's going to have a significant impact on the way in which we trade and indeed upon how our money is valued.
Right. Good explanation there. Now, you mentioned gold a couple of times there, and the first thing that came to my mind was last year when everything broke out between Ukraine and Russia. I think in response to being cut off and sanctioned and having the Russian assets frozen, in order to reestablish, I guess, some type of stability, Russia decided to, the Russian bank decided to, I guess, peg a gram of gold to what was the equivalent to a barrel of oil or something like that. So I think it was 60 rubles to 1 barrel of oil. And to me, and on this side, it was like, okay, is this some type of gold standard connecting gold to oil? And so how has that developed or evolved or died down? Or is that something that's been ramped up or used and just not being talked about much?
Well, what they did, in essence, is they pegged the ruble to the value of gold. So that's what's happened, and that's still in place today. That's fine, and it works, but it doesn't work all the time. Gold as an asset goes up when there are global problems or regional problems. People go for their gold, so it's good during times of stress. And I think that the Russian central bank made a wise strategic move to peg the ruble to gold at that time. A year ago, President Biden was predicting that the ruble would become ruble. It didn't. So the Russian central bank was able to minimize the effects of what the Americans were trying to do, what the Fed were trying to do, and maintain its position. In fact, the Russian ruble last year was the world's best performing currency. So moving to a gold standard or linking it to gold makes a lot of sense. However, the value of commodities goes down as well as up. And although gold is a safe harbor when times are tough, as they are now, and especially for Russia, it is less valuable when things ease out. And hopefully this dreadful conflict will at some point cease. And when that happens, the value of gold will fall, and people will start to look to put their money into more tangible assets, perhaps into infrastructure in Russia's case. But pegging your currency to gold isn't a solution which should necessarily last forever. Quite how the Russian bank sees that, I couldn't comment. But at the moment, it's a good thing. But when things start to gravitate back to normal and peace descends, hopefully upon the world once more, then people will start to sell off gold and use that money to put into areas where it can be used, such as infrastructure and other related projects. Issue that I think China would be very much interested in as regards to construction of projects along its Belt and Road Initiative. So I think China will pick up there. But yes, gold, not perhaps for the long term. Good now, but there are problems ahead with that.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on the BRICS, the new development bank, all the latest, since that's been formed. A lot of nations have joined. I think Egypt just recently joined and a couple other countries. And so that definitely disrupts the World Bank's model of, I guess, extending debt to all these emerging countries and basically continue to drain and bankrupt those nations. It seems like the BRICS nation has a different approach at first. And so share with us some of the latest developments with the new development bank and what's happening with the BRICS. And also this upcoming August, there's a summit in South Africa. And I guess the ICC now has put out an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. How is that all interconnected? Will it work? And giving your thoughts on that.
All right. Well, there's quite a lot to go through. Let's deal with the BRICS or BRICS Plus. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have existed as a bloc. It's not a free trade organization, but it does encourage trade between its members, and successfully so. Has existed for over a decade now. Now, that has been quite successful. So other countries want to join. The BRICS, at its formation, instigated something called the BRICS New Development Bank, the NDB. And what's happened has been that recently Bangladesh, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates all joined the New Development Bank. So therefore, taking equity in that and de facto becoming members of BRICS, collectively known now, I think, as the BRICS Plus. Why did that happen? Well, I think there are reasons to this. Bangladesh is a member of the SAARC, South Asian trade bloc, which includes India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, where I live also, and Myanmar, other countries in there. And that is a significant textiles play, getting cotton into the economies such as China, Russia is quite a big deal, and Bangladesh is the world's largest textile manufacturer. I don't know if you knew that. So having them on board in terms of providing the raw materials to manufacture clothing and apparel and other things is not a bad idea. But that's perhaps the lesser of the triumvirate. The United Arab Emirates, which has also joined the New Development Bank, is developing itself as a regional financial hub akin to that of Singapore and Hong Kong in Asia. The UAE and Dubai in particular are positioning themselves to be a financial hub for the Middle East, a bridge between the West and East, and indeed getting funds into development plans in East Africa. So having the UAE on board is also good for regional redevelopment. Egypt is perhaps a more interesting and significant one. The BRICS already includes, as I mentioned, South Africa. Well, Egypt is, of course, in North Africa. So that gives pretty much the BRICS countries and their allies access to Africa from both the north and the south. The significance of this is that pretty much all of Africa, with the exception of Eritrea, are members of something called the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has eliminated tariffs, intra-African tariffs on pretty much 95% of all products. So having access to a North African country and a South African country to take advantage of those tariff reductions and use Africa's resources, its less expensive labor, and so on and so forth, through the many free trade zones that are developing in Africa, including Egypt. There's a Port Said zone which Russia owns near the Suez Canal. That is a good issue. It's good for Egypt. It's going to bring in foreign investment there from the BRICS. It's good for the other BRICS members because they can manufacture, buy components from Africa, and then sell them back onto the African market or re-export them elsewhere. So this makes a lot of good sense. However, the development of the BRICS Plus isn't going to stop there. They have about another 20-odd countries that have expressed interest in joining: Argentina, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, so on and so forth. So this also is going to expand as a loose trade bloc, and will continue to do so over the coming years. One to watch out for. Now, the other question I think that you alluded to was, well, let's talk about Vladimir Putin first. That's a bit of a strange one. It was, I think that was politically motivated. I don't think there's any chance of a warrant being served on Putin. Russia doesn't recognize the court. The United States doesn't recognize the court that issued that warrant. Neither does China. And I think that the political fallout that it would create were the Russian president to be arrested overseas would just be immense. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it might curtail perhaps any plans, if there were any plans for President Putin to visit other countries. But he's clearly not going to do that. If there's any threat of being arrested for under this warrant, I think that's extremely unlikely. And I think it was more political symbolism. That warrant was issued just 2 days before he met with the Chinese president, which I think tells you a lot. So although it's an interesting issue and makes a lot of copyright for various journalists and editors, particularly in the West, and is used as a vehicle to show how bad and evil Putin is, the reality is that it's unenforceable, and so it's a political gambit. I wouldn't place too much hope that or anything else that is actually going to achieve anything constructive, because it won't, and I don't think it was ever intended to. So I think that's has that. I think there was another question, wasn't there? And I can't remember.
No, so that was just I was trying to get to, like, of course, I know that ICC issued that right at the same time that meeting took place, and so there's an article came out the other day referring to President Ramaphosa, who was the South African president, because South Africa is a part of the ICC, and will there be conflict? Will he, does this put him in a tough position? But then again, of course, that's just Western hype right there. But upcoming summit, BRICS summit in August, and based upon last June, when I think one of the finance ministers in Russia mentioned, as well as I think Putin had talked about the need for a new currency amongst ourselves, referring to the BRICS nations. Is there a possibility that there's some introduction of something new outside of whatever's taking place amongst the currency swaps and things of that nature that could be rolled out from the BRICS?
Yeah. I don't think there's going to be any currency rolled out at that summit. I think it's too soon. But the BRICS have been discussing the formation of a digital current and a digital wallet, which could be used amongst citizens of BRICS nations. And this was being discussed way before the Ukraine situation happened. So those have been going on for some time. I think the issue there is that although I think that this in time will probably happen, just a matter of when, is what measures are the United States prepared to take if they do decide to do this? The US has already threatened China if it links its SIPS global financial messaging network with Russia's SPFS. They've threatened China with that, which did not go down well in Beijing, and I don't think it would go down well in other countries either. Hence perhaps some delays. I don't think that the technology is fully there yet. It requires central bank regulatory approval. They need to make sure that everything works. Otherwise, people using this and they lose their money, you're not going to be happy, right? So I think they've got to make 110% sure that any financial transactions used by new tradable currencies or tokens, as we discussed earlier, are going to work. I would be surprised if there's an announcement during the BRICS summit that such an agreement and such a token is going to be issued. I don't think they're ready for it, but perhaps 2025 might be a different matter.
All right. Now, as we draw towards the end, of course, I have a lot more questions, but I want to keep it short and respect your time. The dollar, de-dollarization, obviously is picking up. There's articles flooding everywhere about concerns of the dollar. Even here, CNN and Fox did a short 4 or 5 minute clip talking about the developments out east and how that might threaten the dollar. Do you think the West is grooming the public here, especially on top of all the banking contagion we're experiencing and just concerns of lack of confidence, for something new? Is the West partially accepting the fact that, the changes here and there might be competition that we have to now prepare our citizens for, or the holders of dollars for, in reference to the future?
I don't think there's going to be any problems with holding dollars. I already mentioned that United States, 25% of its GDP only is in international trade. So while that 25% use of the dollar, that will be eaten away a little bit by the people using alternative currencies, notably the Chinese yuan. I don't think it's going to have much impact on the stability or value of the US dollar. So that's what I've got to say there. However, perhaps longer term, looking forward, I think we are starting to see the collision of two academic schools of thought as regards how you value a currency. Now, the US dollar is famously based upon debt, whereas the new currencies coming in are potentially going to be based upon assets. So how does that square off? I'm not sure. I'm not an economist at that level. But what I would say is that if somebody was going to give me some IOUs in one hand and somebody was going to give me some gold in the other, I'd take the gold. So figuring that out as regards which is the better economic system, and I did point out earlier that there are some issues with using gold as standard. I think that's going to be an academic financial question and debate that is starting to happen and is going to fill up newsprint for the coming years until one system or the other or both start to coexist.
Last question. With all the dollars that exist in the world that has been used as reserve assets, of course, China's minimizing their exposure to, government sovereign debt. And so is there a probability in the future, as, the petro yuan picks up and the currency swaps take more precedence over what's being used in international trade, that those dollars come home to the U.S., back to their creators? And what type of environment do you think the world will be in if we get to that point, if everything comes back?
Well, I think what you're actually describing would be a situation whereby there's two halves to a global economy. One is the Western half, and the other is the Eastern half. There's some thought that it might even be a tripolarity with India in between, as it sort of hedges its bets between West and East. So that might well happen. I don't think that, as I said earlier, stress that I don't think that this will herald the demise of the US dollar, because that will continue to be used within the United States and with countries that the US trades with, assuming that they're not sanctioned and can't use the US dollar, such as the case with Russia. And there's other countries which perhaps are wary of the US dollar because they could be subject to sanctions, as Russia and Iran have been. They could upset the US and find themselves pointing down the barrel of sanctions, which is one reason why they're pushing to use non-US or Euro currencies. So I think the development of the world in which we have various different currencies emerging along with the US dollar, to work with the US dollar in global financial settlements is going to be the case. I don't think that's a bad thing. And I'm sure there's room for all of them. So I wouldn't see that as a trigger for doomsday or apocalyptic collapse of the dollar at all. There's no reason why the dollar can't exist, as it already does, alongside other currencies. It's just that those other currencies are going to become in more common usage in their relevant parts of the world. So I don't see any need to press the alarm button there. But things are changing, especially where I am in Asia.
Yeah, and I think it's similar to the British pound, how it was a reserve currency 100 plus years ago, still in existence, but yet not the head honcho or the primary trade medium that the world uses. And so the USD is going to be around, but it's going to look differently. And I think as a result of that, our quality of life and living standards here will also adjust over time if there's alternatives out there that the world, which makes it so the world doesn't have to use USD to settle trade, and everything is not priced in USD. So that's kind of what I think about things. But
I'd just like to mention I was in Istanbul recently, and Istanbul has the Turkish lira. It's the capital city, not the capital city of Turkey, but the financial hub for Turkey, Istanbul. And you've got a ridiculous situation there because of the again, there's been issues between Ankara and Washington. They don't get on. And the Americans have used the US dollar as a hub, as a trade, to punish Turkey in some regards for political decisions it's made, mainly as regards Syria, but that's by the by. What I'm trying to get to is the fact that you go to an ATM in Turkey right now, and you have options. Normally, you go to a country and pull out the local currency. Well, you can do that as well in Turkey, but most people will opt to pull out euros or US dollars from Turkish ATMs in Turkey. That to me is ridiculous. you should be using the national currency of the country that you're, or the bloc that you're in. So I think that the use of the dollar has perhaps overstepped the mark. It's upset people, and I think that has had consequences on other economies. The Turkish economy went down considerably last year as the lira lost a lot of value. That sort of behavior, I think, has to change. So getting the US dollar out of that, instead of using it as a weapon and putting it back as a trade, I think would instill a lot more confidence in global trade and international relations, frankly.
All right. Well, Christ Devonshire-Ellis, I appreciate you for joining us again on RTD. Definitely, I have to do a better job of keeping tabs and keeping up with you because you're in the midst of everything, and so I definitely the channel is rethinking the dollar. So getting this type of information is very crucial because it's from a different perspective, and I appreciate that. So, thank you for joining us. Where can people, I guess, follow you or stay in tune with what you're doing? I know you're doing some writing and whatnot. I came across your recent article. Can you point people back to your work?
Yeah, the easiest way to read up on what I do, I cover a lot. I'm an Asia guy, and I publish a lot of different regional magazines, publications. They can all be found updated daily, collectively at asiabriefing.com. You go there, asiabriefing.com, you'll see all the articles which reproduce my team of writers and editors from all over the Asian and Middle East region, Silk Road, Russia, so on and so forth. It's all there, and you can pick and choose what you like to see. There's about 20 different articles a day on that. We have about 20 million readers. It's a powerful tool. asiabriefing.com. Thank you for allowing me to mention that.
No problem. No problem. Once again, thank you for joining us. Definitely look forward to reaching out to you, hopefully later this year, and check in with you and see what's happening then. But other than that, thank you for blessing us with your presence and time. And of course, continue to do what you do. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Okay. Bye-bye.